Today we want to answer the question, are there wrong ways to battle sin? And Owen in chapter 5 of Mortification of Sin basically says, yes, there's at least one wrong way to battle sin, and that is to battle sin in a way that you eventually stop battling sin. And when you stop battling sin, you're battling sin in the wrong way. One of the big ideas in this chapter for Owen is that removing sin completely is not possible in this life. Now, you might aim at that. You will want sin to be completely gone from your life, and yet you must recognize that it will never happen. You might think of sin as a bit like of an intruder in your house, and when someone breaks into your house, you want to stop that intruder from causing trouble. And what you want to have happen is for that intruder to leave. And Owen wants you to think that, yes, you want the intruder to leave, but instead what the intruder might do is just sit down in the corner and be quiet. And the fact that the intruder is always there means that you always have to be on guard. There'll never be a time in which you can think, I don't have to worry about sin anymore because it's completely gone from my house. Instead, you ought to think, the sin is still there, and I must be on guard to see that the intruder causes no trouble. The next idea is that only battling outward sin is not true mortification of sin. Consider a person who has struggles with the sin of outburst of anger. Well, what we might think of that person in terms of making progress is it would be nice if that person would stop outwardly being angry and stop outwardly yelling at people. And that certainly is progress. If they can stop outwardly yelling at people, that's a step in the right direction. And that's not the same thing, though, as fully battling sin effectively. If they still have anger inside of them, then the anger is still there and the problem is still there. The sin is still there, even though there's no outward manifestation of it. Another problem that comes in this regard is to certain people with certain personality types that are not inclined to outburst of anger. Maybe they have calm dispositions. They always keep their cool. Well, if all we think about when we think about battling sin is don't outwardly sin, then these people with calm dispositions may be misled into thinking that they don't have sin at all to battle. And yet they do have sin to battle. It's just their personality means that that sin is expressed in less overt and obvious ways to outsiders, and yet the sin is still there and it still needs to be battled. One other thing along this regard is the idea that over time, certain sins that you had trouble with, you may not have trouble with, and this is not the same thing as saying that you have defeated this sin. Many of the sins that we have in our youth, we tend to outgrow. And so as we get older, we don't battle with the same sins that we battled when we were younger. And yet it's not necessarily true that just because you don't do the same sins that you did when you were younger, that sin is not there. As a matter of fact, that same sin may be present and yet may be being manifested in perhaps a less youthful way and perhaps in a more adult way. Owen puts it this way. He that changes pride for worldliness, sensuality for Pharisaism, vanity in himself to the contempt of others, let him not think that he hath mortified the sin that he seems to have left. He hath changed his master, but is a servant still. Think of that one phrase, just someone who used to have lots of pride and used to think very highly of himself. And as he gets older, he recognizes he's not as awesome as he used to think that he was. And so he's given up that pride a little bit. And yet that same sin of pride now manifests himself not in mainly thinking much of himself, but just looking down on others. Next, consider that occasionally resisting sin is not the same thing as mortifying sin or putting sin to death. Consider the fact that many of us are most inclined to battle sin whenever we sin in really embarrassing or significant ways. We sin in a way and we're so embarrassed we think, I'm never going to let this happen again. These sorts of sins work in this way, according to Owen. They work to the disturbance of his peace, terror in his conscience, dread of scandal, and evident provocation of God. This awakens and stirs up all that is in the man and amazes him, fills him with abhorrency of sin and himself for it, sends him to God, makes him cry out as for life, to abhor his lust as hell, and to set himself against it. And so this man is really ashamed of the sin that he's got. He recognizes it makes all kinds of trouble in his life, and he really and truly does want to no longer sin in this way. And so he wants God's help, and he's on high alert, as it were, to do all that he can to keep this sin from happening again. Owen compares this to an army that perhaps is camped somewhere near their enemy, and everyone has fallen asleep, and in comes the enemy, and the enemy kills one of the important members of this army. And the army wakes up and they begin to, everybody's on high alert, and everybody says, we are going to find the one who has murdered our comrade. We are going to interview everyone. No one will rest until justice is served. And this sense in which someone's on high alert to make sure that sin is found and rooted out is exactly the type of thing that you could do. And yet what many of us do is we're stirred up to find the sin, and then in time, though, we're no longer on high alert. We're lulled to sleep, and what Owen basically says is that the sin is there, and he's just hiding in the shadows. And it's waiting until you're not on alert anymore, waiting until the army goes back to sleep. And once it's back to sleep, it's ready to do trouble again. And so what we do need to do is to, yes, battle the sin, but don't stop battling sin. Always be on high alert. Owen's emphasis on continually battling sin reminds us of this important fact. Yes, it is important that we battle sin and seek to walk in obedience to the Lord in order that we might return to the Lord. And yet we must also remember that that battling of sin and walking in obedience is also necessary for us to remain in communion and close fellowship with Him. And so for these reasons, may God work in our hearts a longing to always be on guard and always be battling sin and to never give it up as long as we live.